What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today I'll be going over a mid-round draft decision at the wide receiver spot. Originally, this was going to be our Lamb, Aiyuk, and Higgins video that I was very excited for, but after Chase got drafted by the Bengals, kind of looked into things and I was like, I know I've said that Higgins doesn't get a huge decrease, but he gets a decrease, right? Like he obviously goes down in value, and I think it's pretty clearly now Higgins behind those two, and I wanted to make it three players, so I added in Diontae Johnson. I hadn't fully finished my take on him, so kind of wanted to dig into the research on him a little bit as well. So it's going to be Ceedee Lamb versus Brandon Aiyuk versus Diontae Johnson. But first, gotta start things off as usual. Stat of the day, yesterday's stat. Since 2014, how many wide receivers age 34 plus have posted a 1,000-yard season? The answer is 3. Steve Smith, Anquan Bolden, and Larry Fitzgerald. Andrew Bell-Richard was the first to get that on YouTube, and David Amber was the first to get that on Twitter. Today's stat, which tight end last season had the highest scoring week in fantasy? I don't think it mattered on the scoring format. It was a monster week, but we'll just say in half PPR who had the highest scoring week. All right, so first up in the breakdown is Ceedee Lamb. Now, Lamb was taken 17th overall last season, third wide receiver off the board. Oftentimes, rookie receivers, they struggle at the beginning of the season before breaking out like midway through and in the later portion of the season, of course, assuming they break out at all. But that wasn't really the case for Ceedee Lamb. I mean, even sharing the field with Cooper and Gallup, Lamb commanded no fewer than 6 targets, no fewer than 59 receiving yards in each of his first 5 games, averaging 5.8 receptions, 87 yards, and 2 touchdowns over those 5 weeks. And then Dak went down. After that, Lamb averaged just about 4 receptions for 46 yards, 3 total scores across the remaining 11 weeks. But that's not too surprising, right? I mean, he goes from Dak to a combination of Andy Dalton, Ben DiNucci, and Garrett Gilbert. Like, of course he's going to see a drop in his production, especially as a rookie. The crazy thing is, he still had 111 targets, which was only 19 behind Cooper. It was more than Gallup. And if we look at the comps to his rookie numbers, they're pretty good. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say he had the best rookie season of all time, but only 7 receivers ever have produced more than 74 receptions for 935 yards and 5 touchdowns, which is what he did as a rookie. So that's pretty good. And only Justin Jefferson was able to do that at age 21 or younger. So he had a fantastic season, and I do have all the confidence in the world that he can improve on those numbers this season, especially with a full season with Dak. So what could that look like? Well, his pace with Dak last season was 93 receptions for 1,575 yards and 6.4 touchdowns. Now, that is far too aggressive to use as a projection, right? Like, that is not his average outcome. But I want to say one thing, that's within his range of outcomes, certainly. He could have 100 receptions for 1,600 yards, 7 or 8 touchdowns. That could happen. Just on the higher end, right? Especially with the 17-game season. Remember that. When you're looking at projections a season, 17 games. So you get that extra week. But on average, we'll say this. He should probably be around 5 to 6 receptions. That feels like a very conservative projection for him. I don't see him falling in that 4 range. I mean, that would be very shocking if he went back to what he was doing with the backup quarterbacks now that he is Dak healthy. I think 5 to 6 receptions is almost a floor projection, and if he maintains his roughly 15 yards per reception, gets around 7 to 8 total touchdowns, because also he's going to have 1 carry every week. They're going to get him the ball and end around, so he could score a rushing touchdown. So 7 or 8 total touchdowns. Again, that 15 yards per reception he had with Dak, that's going to come out to about 75 yards. A few touchdowns on the season, 5 to 6 receptions a game. And if you do out the math, that's about 13 half PPR points per game, about 15.5 in full PPR, which last season would be the wide receiver 17 and 16 and half in full PPR, respectively. So I'm feeling pretty good about my current ranking on him. So going into this video, had him as the wide receiver 17 in both formats. And I think that's true. I think that Ceedee Lamb is a mid-range wide receiver 2. I mean, remember that projection. 5.5 receptions. You think that's doable for Lamb? That's kind of your baseline here. If you think that is ridiculous for some reason, you think he's going to be at 3 to 4 range, you're not drafting him, right? But if you're like me, you think 5 to 6 is a pretty good projection. He's going to be, around a mid-range wide receiver 2. And if you look at his ADP, he's going to end up being a pretty good pick. It is also worth noting that he has the 6th lowest risk rating among wide receivers on our website. He's got the draft capital. He produced in his rookie season. He's part of a tier 1 offense. We know he's going to start and get snaps. There is no concerning injury history. So the reasons for drafting Lamb are glaringly obvious, and the reasons not to are pretty hard to find. I do these breakdowns. I look at the risk. I look at the upside. Finding the risk with Lamb, the literal only thing is Dak. Is Dak going to be healthy? That is the only risk factor with Lamb. Because if Dak's going to be healthy, Lamb is going to be fantastic. So that is the one thing you can point to and say, well, what about this? Absolutely. If we get news that he suffers a setback, that he's only going to play half this season, we need to reevaluate the Lamb take and realize that his projection needs to be cut. But it's seeming like Dak's going to be fully healthy for the full year, and so that's what I'm operating under the assumption of, especially for this video. But again, if that changes, we'll have to update our take. So that is it for Lamb. I will move on to Brandon Aiyuk now. So Aiyuk was also a first-round rookie last season, but he went a few picks later at 25th overall. And what do you know? He also had a really, really nice rookie season, finished with 60 receptions, 748 yards, and 7 touchdowns. But that was only through 12 weeks. So in points per game, he actually finished 17th and 18th in half and full PPR, respectively, only about 1.5 points per game behind Justin Jefferson. So everyone knows Jefferson just went off last season, had one of the better rookie seasons we've seen at wide receiver. Being 1.5 points behind that is pretty darn good. Now, the biggest reason people might be off Aiyuk is the same reason I have him ranked 34th among wide receivers in the risk ratings. The total volume of the offense mixed with team competition. No matter who the quarterback ends up being, we can be pretty confident in saying the 49ers will be a lower volume offense. They're going to be a lower volume, especially passing offense. This team wants to run the ball. They finish in the top half of rushing percentage each of the last 3 years while not cracking the top 10 in plays per game in that stretch. So it'd be one thing if they ran the ball a ton, but they were top 3 in plays per game. Or another thing if they didn't run a ton of plays, but they passed the ball on a high percentage of their plays. But they run it a ton, and they're not going to be an upper-end total volume offense, so they can't make up for it. So the pass attempts are likely not going to be there a ton. And if we look at the target distribution, well, last year was a bit strange because of injuries, right? So the target leader was Aiyuk, and then it was Kendrick Bourne because Kittle and Debo, they were obviously ahead of Bourne when they were healthy, but they missed a ton of time due to injury. We actually only have 3 total weeks last season with all of Debo, Kittle, and Aiyuk healthy. And it was only in weeks 6 and 7 that Jimmy G was also fully healthy. So over those 2 weeks, we have a split of 17 targets for Kittle, 11 for Debo, and 10 for Aiyuk. But even looking at those 2 games is flawed because one of them, they just destroyed the Patriots, right? If you remember, that was the game that Jeff Wilson had 17 carries for over 110 yards and 3 touchdowns in basically one half of football. It was a little bit after halftime. Then he gets hurt. We see Michael Hasty take over, but it was just the ground game, just dominating. So even looking at that game, it's can we even use the data from that game? But regardless, Kittle, I think we got to assume is the top option. In a fully healthy season, he is very likely going to end up with the most targets. But there are real cases to be made for Aiyuk and Debo as the second option at receiver. And because that's the case, I am starting to lean towards them splitting the remaining targets. And if that is the case, then I actually do think, our incredibly small sample is a little bit useful because they did throw the ball 29 times per game over those 2 weeks with Debo and Aiyuk each getting 5 to 6 targets a week. So at the moment, that's what I'm expecting from Aiyuk, is around that 5 to 6 targets for around 60, 65 receiving yards and in a pretty similar touchdown range as Lamb, so in that 7 to 8 range. And honestly, he's also going to see a small boost, if not maybe a little bit bigger boost than Lamb. I do think that the 49ers are going to continue to use Debo and Aiyuk with like end arounds, getting them the ball really quickly, even on screen passes, but definitely as running backs as well. So what does that mean when it comes to Aiyuk compared to Lamb? I do think, if we look at these numbers, I was saying 5 to 6 receptions for Lamb, 5 to 6 targets for Aiyuk. And then if we also look at the risk, well, Lamb was like the 6th safest wide receiver. Aiyuk was 34th. That does mean that their median outcomes are going to be very, very similar to each other. And I just think that, like I said, the risk being greater for Aiyuk, lower for Lamb, and also, do they make up for it in upside? Because it's one thing if, Aiyuk was riskier, but he's got far greater upside. But I think it's the opposite. I think that Lamb is the safer pick and also has a greater ceiling. He's part of that incredible offense. He is, I believe, the more talented wide receiver. And so things are just more pointing towards Lamb. And I just think it is harder to see Aiyuk being the target leader, right? Like if he's the target leader, it means he beat out Deebo Samuel, and then he also beat out Kittle, right? But for Lamb, he kind of only has to beat out Amari Cooper, and I think that's just easier to do. And then you have to assume, even if he doesn't, even if him and Cooper are even, it's a higher volume offense. So he could still greatly outproduce Aiyuk, even if Aiyuk comes out like as a target leader for San Fran, and Lamb is kind of tied for the target leader. Well, there are more targets. So as of right now, I'm keeping the ranking on Aiyuk. We're going to keep him as a wide receiver 24 and 23 and half and full PPR respectively, just a little bit behind Ceedee Lamb. But what about Diontae? So we've got Ceedee, then we've got Aiyuk. Where does Diontae land in this range? So last season, if you remember, it was actually his second season as a pro, had 59 receptions for 680 yards and 5 touchdowns as a rookie, and then 88 receptions for 923 yards and 7 touchdowns in his second season across effectively 14 games. And, the thing was with Johnson, he was awesome when he was healthy. If you look at the full season, finished as the wide receiver 21 in PPR points per game, but that's counting weeks 3 and 5 where he missed, most of those games due to injury, and he had, 1 catch for negative 2 yards, and also week 14, he only played 49% of the snaps. So if we look at the 12 games last season where he played at least 50% of the snaps, he averaged 17.3 PPR points per game, which beat out A.J. Brown for 7th last season. That is a big difference from 21st, but it shows what counting, a 0 and a 0.8 are going to do to your numbers. And if we look at those 12 games, remember, he played over 50% of the snaps, his volume was insane. I mean, in 10 of 12, he had double-digit targets. That is unheard of volume, and it is pretty hard to fail when you're given that many looks. But here's where things get a little bit dicey. So he was just operating under incredible volume, but even with 144 targets, including 10 different games with at least 10 targets, like I said, he only went over 100 yards twice and over 8 receptions once. And he also led the league with 16 drops, 14 of which came within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. There is risk here. Had Juju left, I would say we're full steam ahead drafting Diontae Johnson. But their current wide receivers are the same as last season. Diontae, Juju, Claypool, and James Washington, not to mention, Ebron at tight end, and now new feature back Najee Harris at running back. That's a ton of talent, all revolving around the corpse that is Ben Roethlisberger. I mean, the Steelers may have been 12-3, in games that Big Ben played last season, but their schedule was cake and their defense was elite. It wasn't because Big Ben was any good. His arm was actually shot last season. He was pretty bad. So there's really no telling how much he's got left in the tank. And if you're coaching the Steelers, what do you do? Would you have Big Ben throw the ball 40.5 times per game again? Or would you maybe use your first round running back a bit more? Last season the Steelers ranked second to last in rushing percentage, but I find that hard to believe that they're going to repeat that this season. I mean, look at what happened last year. They just fell apart. Teams kind of figured out, they can't push the ball downfield with Big Ben. They're throwing the ball like 3 yards every play. Like, this is not a good offense. And then they tank down the stretch. But even just looking beyond, can the offense change? Can Big Ben be better? Again, look at this roster. Diontae, Juju, Claypool, Washington, Ebron. Are you telling me it's not at least a little bit possible that with all these drops from Diontae last season, it won't have an effect? You know, maybe they look in this offseason, they say, hey, Claypool was fantastic as a rookie. Let's maybe shift a little bit away from these short targets to Diontae, you know, getting like 5 yards a clip on these short targets for him. Maybe we transition some of those into deep shots for Claypool, or maybe even screens for Claypool. He's still an athletic freak. Or maybe, you know what? We're going to change our offense completely. That's entirely possible. We don't want to do this dinking and dumping, because when teams figure this out, we're barely going to score. 19 points against Baltimore, 17 against Washington, 15 against Buffalo, 17 against the Bengals, 28 against the Colts, and then 22 against the Browns. You know, and then you say, oh, well, Nick, maybe, I don't know, maybe they've had a bad stretch and, you know, they dominated in that playoff game, right? No, they put up a bunch of points, but it was 28-0 after one, 35-10 at halftime. Like, this offense fell apart when they weren't playing absolute trash opponents. You got to think this offseason they're going to reevaluate, and there's a very strong chance that they come into this new season with a different game plan. And if they do, it's very likely to benefit Claypool and Harris. Those are the two players you got to think they're looking to get a lot of looks this season. Both of those are going to be a downgrade if they feature either of those guys to Diontae. So where does he fit in the ranking? You got to think, listening to all those negatives, I'm putting him behind Lamb, right? I think that among these three, it's pretty clearly Lamb as the lead guy. Probably has the highest ceiling. He's the most talented. He's just part of the better offense. Like, it just makes a lot of sense to put him first. After that, I do think that it's a little bit difficult, and I think a lot depends on what we do expect the Steelers offense to do this season. As of right now, I'm keeping the ranking I had going into this as Diontae over Aiyuk. I still expect him to be, talking about Diontae here, the most targeted wide receiver in Pittsburgh. And I can't say for sure that Aiyuk will even be the second most targeted wide receiver in San Fran. But I want to say this, that ranking could easily change. I mean, if beat reporters feel good about Aiyuk starting over Samuel and being more targeted than him, or it looks like the Steelers are going to be altering their offense, they're going to be going with a big ground presence, they're going to be featuring Claypool, well, then I will absolutely change my ranking and move Aiyuk over Diontae Johnson. So if you want to see my most up-to-date take on these two, as well as every other player, you can always check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? But thanks for watching.